had this conversation today with someone, Tom. We were talking about firearms, but the point I was making to him, it was a reporter, we try to compartmentalise things, crime especially, but whereas I had been working in the drugs unit up until then, now when I collared someone, they would say, Mr. McLean, I can give you a dealer in such and such a place, and I'd say, shut up, who cares about your dealer? I'm looking for firearms. But I can give you a shoplifter. Yeah, shut up, I'm looking for firearms. Now let's talk seriously here. Good evening, Tom. How are you?
I'm very well, Simon. How are you?
Fantastic. And I was wearing my new Crime Time Inc. sweatshirt today to the football. So we'll have a whole new bunch of listeners this time next week. Have you got yours yet?
Yes, I have. I've got it here, actually.
Let me ask you a question. Does it fit you?
It's a bit on the large side, but better that.
Tom, when I joined, my inspector at Oxford Street here in Glasgow in Strathclyde Police was a guy, Tam Duff. And he had the old slashed peak and all that. He was the old PTI, he was hard as nails. And we all got our uniforms issued. This is December 1978, and we all got our uniforms. You know how exciting it was getting your uniform. And I remember us all standing lined up with our tunics and all that on. We still never had numerals, they were still to get handed out. And he came round and did an inspection, and he would pull the top of your tunic out to see if it was fitting. And mine came out about 3 inches. And I thought he's going to send me back to Pitt Street to get a new uniform. And he said, aye, you'll soon fill that out. A few fish suppers on the night shift, son. And he was absolutely right. Because I tried it on about 10 years after I came out of uniform, and I couldn't get the buttons near each other. I couldn't get it to button at all. Tam was right.
I remember Tam Duff. He was the PTI at the college when I was there. And he was, yes one of these guys. But he was absolutely great. And he recognised that he made sure that you knew how to wear a uniform properly, which is important. Our PTI, when I joined, he was a boxer, ex-Royal Naval boxer called Bob Crozier. He was a lovely man, but he used to tell the story. When you're a Cossack, nobody was a Cossack, but when you're a Cossack, he said, you get a belt, he said, that fits you. And when that belt doesn't fit you, you're not a Cossack anymore. That's what he said. I said, but we're no Cossacks. Sharp.
I'm sure somebody told me when I complained about my uniform and tunic, they said, see if you get one that fits you, you're deformed. Oh dear. So that's a new Crime Time Inc. merchandise that we've got now. There's only you and I that have got them so far. And our producer, of course. Producer, editor, you name it. Scriptwriter now as well, now that he's discovered AI. Tom, we're doing the second part of our Undercover. Frivolous looking back. At the time, it was very serious. And it was real jail time that people got when they get caught, whether it was with heroin at the time or stolen goods or whatever the undercover operation was. But I think what you were alluding to was a deep cover, is when people live the life of someone completely different for a period of time in order to infiltrate whatever it is the operation's focused on. So let's hear what the Deputy Chief's going to ask me about. And I've still not got a witness.
I think for the sake of the listener, we should not personalise it to your experience rather than talk about the whole principle and business of undercover work, because I think it's one of the areas of police work which grossly misrepresented in crime fiction, whether it be television or writing. I said in the last Crime Time Inc., I'm sure you always see the guy sitting in the car for hours on end, eating hamburgers and drinking coffee, and all of a sudden he jumps out and chases someone. And it's so far from the truth, because even, you and I are a little bit out of time now in terms of the time we've been away, and things have got even more structured because that's the manner of the way it works. But even in our time, it was a complicated procedure. And I just thought for our listeners, we could talk through that, and maybe you would reflect on how it affected you without going into deep personal stuff, which you understandably may not wish to do. So I started, I think, in Crime Time Inc. 1, Undercover 1, talking about recruitment. And from what I can recall, you said that you more or less just fell into it. Is that right?
No. I think I fell into being used, and that's really what undercovers are, is being used. UCs are used. That's my mentality now. Because it needs a certain type of person, it needs a certain type of mentality to be able to do it. But when I said fell into it, it was over a long period of time, that if there was anything that they needed somebody in plain clothes, somebody to go and not be a policeman, then it was you. And I could pick out 2 or 3 other guys in the division that would be like-minded, that were like me and could do that kind of thing without batting an eyelid. And when you're thinking about it just now, you're probably thinking of the guys that you worked with and supervised over many years, the type of character that you would want that could go and carry that off, that could go and be somebody else for a certain length of time and come back again, which is probably the key point. So fell into it's not the right description, but I gradually became more and more used. For example, when we had the amnesty for firearms back in, must have been 94, something like that, we had an amnesty in Strathclyde, and I was automatically picked in the division to represent G Golf Division at that time, as it was, and I got to pick the other guy that was going to neighbour me for 6 months. Now it's controversial because it's my perception, and I don't know how true it is or not, but all the UCs that I ever knew and worked alongside, sometimes supervised, they all had, this sounds terrible coming from me, but it's the truth, they all had issues. They all had domestic issues or something in their lives that wasn't right, and it made them a bit less risk averse than the rest of us. They had maybe come from sometimes a disciplinary procedure that had gone on, and they'd come out the other end of it. They were scarred in some way. Does that make any sense, Tom, to you as a senior officer looking down at the UCs that were plucked?
Yeah, it does, really. And it comes in this business that so many of these jobs in the police were what I used to describe as self-selecting. People were naturally drug squad officers, or were naturally CID officers, or were naturally not any of these things. Nothing in the whole world could have made them a good detective. And I knew very good detectives that would have been like fish out of water if you'd put them in a traffic unit or something like that. So there's a degree of self-selection. Comes back to what we said about the police service being a broad church. So tell me, so I get the picture and I know exactly what you mean. I can picture in my mind a guy I worked with in a division who is exactly like you, who just had a feel for it. He could talk to anybody. He could get himself in and out of trouble very, very ably. He was one of these people who just faded into the background. Okay, so that's fine. Did you get any training?
Yes. The final element of that was that I went to the commander, to my then divisional commander, and explored the possibility of having a year out, of taking a year off, a sabbatical, because my daughter was terminally ill. And I was struggling to whether I should go and devote myself to charity work, whether I should go and be with her 24/7, which would have been a punishment for her more than anything else, because she was okay at that time, but there was a clock ticking in the background. So I was very unsettled. I was very dissatisfied. I had been in the CID for far too long. You spoke about this in our last episode about leaving officers in situ. So much so that when I went and said that I wanted to go back into uniform to take some time out, it was almost unheard of. And I'm sure it's what flagged me up, because I was then approached sometime after that, when I was in uniform actually, and offered the job undercover and surveillance, which was a big appeal to me. And I think the background checks and the homework that's done on the prospects is all done prior to me ever knowing anything about it. Whether the commander had any input into that, I'm not sure. But they came to me and said, here's a job that might suit you. And by God, it did, because it got me away from the day-to-day constraints of being on the book or being on my community beat, which I was loving at the time, or the shift patterns. It took me away from all of that, gave me time that I could manage myself, and opened up a whole new world to me. You asked me about training. It took everything to the next level. everything that I loved about surveillance and about the plainclothes work that I was doing and the drugs work that I was doing, took all of that to a new level. And where I was working with other guys who were like-minded, who were maybe just a wee bit off the wall, the 10%, it's where in my book, the 10% was born in my head, was thinking about that 10% of the people we've worked with who just don't fit in. They don't want to walk a beat. They just need something a wee bit different to get focused on. And our services do that, not just the police, but our services do that too. They recognise people that have got something wanting, and they utilise that.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I wasn't aware of the exact circumstances. I knew you'd lost your girl. I knew that, but I didn't know the exact circumstances of it. Did that fit in all right then? Did your undercover work dovetail with that terrible family pressure that you must have been under at that time?
Yes, because I was totally in control of my time then, Tom. Because the one thing about UC is nobody can make you stay. Nobody can make you, because you need to be in control at all times. And your safety is the priority, of course, and the safety of others. And it was all part of my legend as well. The great thing about building a legend, which is the story that you're going to carry with you and utilise all the time, it's your history. It becomes your antecedent history, where you went to school, your relationships, friends, all the rest of it. It was great that I could build Louise into that. And her illness, I changed the illness for form's sake, because nothing can be traceable. The more truth you can build into the legend, the better, because there's less chance of you ever slipping up. And if I ever spoke about, which I did regularly, it was my big excuse to get out of situations sometimes, or to get away for a weekend or away for longer. Because if you're working undercover in an area, you need to have stories to get you out of it periodically, like everyone. And people come and go all the time in real life. So mine was that I had a daughter who was terminally ill, which happened to be the truth. And that's great. That's a great legend, that part of it, because if somebody spoke to me about it, I could speak all night. I had real experience of being in hospital, of sleeping on hospital floors, of dealing with the medical profession and the pluses and minuses, placebo effects and medications and everything, and the mentality of dealing with a kid who was diagnosed when she was 6 months old. So I had a fantastic legend as far as that was concerned, and the reason to get out and go and see her and go and see my family.
That's interesting, Simon. So tell me then, in terms of your handler, because the key to good UC operations, in my view, is that you've got someone that's suitable, someone that's psychologically prepared, someone that's got the skill set, got the training, but there must also be a very careful handling and management to make sure the UC officer does not get overexposed, and to make sure that the officer does not get damaged in the process. And in my experience, a lot were, frankly, in my time. I don't think we were too clever at that, to be honest with you. And I'm just asking, obviously, you were in a different part of Scotland to me. How did you find that? Was the handling effective? Were your handlers as well trained as you were?
They were. We were all part of the same structure and same training and same ethos, same MO, everything. But there was a different mentality back then, Tom, and drink really was this. Everything would be done in a pub over a pint. It was much more informal than I know it is now. Nowadays, there's accountability and there's procedures and there's systems in place to make sure. It's a bit like counsellors who, after they've counselled a client, they have to go and get debriefed. And that person goes and gets debriefed. Everybody's offloading all the time so that it's policed in some way and looked over. It wasn't really like that then. And unfortunately, they built up a relationship with the handler, because the biggest problem with undercover work is the word trust, because you're in a quandary all the time, because you can't trust a word. You and I know we can't trust a word that comes out of criminals' mouths when we're speaking to them, without building up quite a rapport and getting to know them very well. And it same works the other way. And you and I have spoke about this before. The biggest problem for a UC is that exposure. You really are. It's the loneliest place in the whole world, because your mind is still working. And if you don't have that full faith, even the faith in your handler is got to be there. But who's he talking to? And who's he talking to? and who's going home and talking to who. And at the end of the day, you've used this word and we've done an episode about this, but you do feel expendable a lot of the time and your imagination runs riot. You become totally paranoid because you're working both sides of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously can't trust the criminals that you're dealing with, wherever it is that they're involved in. And sometimes you build up a better rapport with them than you have with your colleague. Because you and I know the politics of police information and intelligence. It's not a one-stop shop. Everybody's got an agenda. Everybody's got enemies within the job or competitors within the job. Everybody's got their own corner that they're fighting. And that might be because they're interested in robberies, or it might be because they're interested in drugs. So all of that's going on behind the scenes, and you've got no knowledge of it. All you know is that you're the guy that's exposed in the front line. So you start withholding information. You start with, we all do it. We all did it. You start withholding information and putting in some information to test if it comes back to you, because your life's on the line. And all it needs is one phone call, and you don't exist anymore. All of a sudden, you're out in a field with a gun at your head. It's very difficult to explain all that on here.
No, I get it, absolutely. I was going to speak to you about what we now know as the Stockholm Syndrome. And just for those of you who don't know what the Stockholm Syndrome is, it comes from a bank raid in Stockholm, where hostages were taken and the bank robbers and the hostages were locked in a large safe for over a number of days, as I recall, certainly a long number of hours. And during that time, the hostage takers and the hostages actually began to have a rapport, so much so that they became protective of each other. And the postscript to the Stockholm Syndrome is that eventually, after it was all done and dusted, and after the robbers had been arrested and put in prison and served long terms of imprisonment, one of the hostages actually married one of the hostage takers. That's become known as the Stockholm Syndrome. But generally speaking, it's about just what you spoke about, where you said you actually have more in common with a criminal than you do with your own organisation. That's always the dangerous time, and that's when UCs have got to be pulled out for a period of time to get their balance back. Was that done in your case? Were you content that there was enough attention paid to that?
Never. It was always operational decisions, Tom. It was always about getting the job done. And the UC is what I would now term collateral damage. I don't think any of the decisions were made for our mental health or for with that concern, unless you were going off the rails completely and not contacting, not being in touch. I know guys that have been plucked out, just arrested and taken away just to get them out of a situation,
right?
Because they had just lost contact. They had just decided to bugger this. And they were maybe making more money. They'd maybe found a lucrative niche for themselves. There's so many dangers involved in doing this kind of work. We were mentioning about the television there. We need to lighten it a wee bit, because I was watching the Blue Light. I don't know if you've seen it at all. I watched the first episode last night. It's set in Belfast within the last year or two. It's the first episode, and I'll probably watch some more of it because it was quite good. The tutor cop and the probationer, I think he's out for the first time, were driving along, and the tutor cop saw a car in front of him, and he said, "What do you think's wrong with that?" And it turned out the car was about 10 years old, but the plate said it was only 2 years old, so they pulled it over. And he let the young cop go up and do his first talk to the driver. But it turns out that they were undercover cops, and they called them Sneaky Pete's. That's what they called them over by. And I remember that. It just brought back so many memories. The UCs were totally rude. They just refused to answer. And then they said, "Listen, go and get your act together." And they drove off. And the young cop said, "What's happening?" And that struck me as what you're saying there, that it's just, for starters, UCs would never have a car that didn't matter. The legend has got to be the legend. That's the car. Everything like that gets checked meticulously, because it's something stupid like that could catch you out so easily.
Yeah.
And secondly, they would never be rude to the cops and drive off. They would bring their license out. They would act like Joe Public.
Yeah.
Because you don't know who's watching, and you don't know that young cop. He can go home and tell his mum, "Oh, we met a couple of undercovers today in a Ford Orion," or whatever that happened to be. It's what you're saying there, TV. And it's the same with surveillance. Honest to God, I can't watch anything to do with surveillance at all, because if I had any hair left, that's probably where it's all gone. It's tearing it out, watching daft surveillance stuff on the telly. After I'd left the police, I had a private investigation business. And I had a client who hired me to watch his fiancée because he suspected that she was being less than faithful behind his back. And he was going away in business, I think, and it was Valentine's Day. So he thought if she was going to get up to no good, then Valentine's Day would be the day to watch her. So I was hired to do that. Now, Valentine's Day is a tricky day, as you can imagine. An old romantic like you, Tom, will know fine what I'm talking about here, that Valentine's Day is very special. So for me to say that I was going to work on Valentine's Day went down like a lead balloon at home. So I went out on Valentine's Day to watch this female who was working at the time. She was working in a well-known store in Braehead shopping centre. So it was a simple job of ensuring she was at her work and then waiting for her to leave at the end of the day and see if she got picked up, if she went home, I knew her car, etc., etc. And the long story short here is that I told my then wife what I was doing. Because it was Valentine's Day, I had to justify it. And I told her what I was doing, which I wouldn't normally have done. And when I was on the job, I was very conscious that this female was behaving a bit irrationally. When you've been doing surveillance for a long time, it's just instinctive, really, at the end of the day. And I knew that she was probably onto me. I also knew that I hadn't blown it that day, that it wasn't because of getting too close or showing my face or whatever. There was just something not right. But I met the client the day after and I gave him the report and he was raging because she had said to him, "You had somebody following me yesterday." She didn't know who'd been following her. She didn't have a car regi. She didn't have a description. She had nothing. But she knew that somebody had been following her. She couldn't tell him any more than that. And what had happened was that my then wife had told her brother. When he said, "What are you doing for Valentine's Day?" she'd said to him, "Oh, Simon's working. He's got to go and do some surveillance, some woman that's cheating on her boyfriend down in Braehead." No more than that, or so I'm led to believe. And he told his girlfriend this. You'll never guess, Simon's got to work tomorrow, and it's in Braehead where you work. You know where this is going, don't you? His girlfriend put two and two together and sussed out who this female would be and said to her at her work, "I think your fiancé, he's away just now, isn't he? Yeah, I think he's hired a private detective to watch you." So that's the kind of thing in our work, in that kind of work, that loose tongues, remember the old wartime? You'll remember, Tom, I don't, I've only seen it in movies, that loose tongues cost lives. And that's very much the case.
This emergency intervention, there was once or twice when I was directing UC operations where I had to make a decision to pull people out because something else was happening in another part of the forest, as it were, which was going to lead them to be placed in grave danger. And I'm particularly talking now about this issue of participating informants. In other words, the UCs were going to be placed in a situation where they had to be involved in quite serious criminal activity. Did you have any experience of that?
Yes, regularly. The hardest thing, being involved in the criminal activity was never a problem because you were getting the information at the time. You were there for a reason, and the means always justified the ends. The hardest bit was drugs, Tom, because I've never had any time for drugs whatsoever. I've probably had a wee puff of cannabis once or twice in my life and thought it was horrible. But that was probably the hardest bit for me, and sometimes having to pretend to be an intravenous drug user. There must be settees, couches, pieces of furniture all over, mainly the northeast of England that I worked in, because that's where the stuff went. All sorts of pills disguised, and I used to carry placebo stuff that I knew what it was, and I could switch it myself. And if anybody had seen it or found it, they would just assume it was drugs anyway that I was keeping for myself. So all sorts of tricks you come up with to try and not use drugs. That was probably harder. Don't get me wrong, I never saw anybody shot. I never participated in anything like that. But if it had happened, there's not a thing I could have done, Tom. There's not a thing I could have done. If I'm standing there and I saw plenty of shooters, saw plenty of bravado and plenty of shooters produced and lying about and talk about guns and all the rest of it. And it's part of the training we did was to learn all about the sign-offs and all the procedures and all the rest of it. But if somebody had brought a gun out and put it to somebody's head, there's not a thing I could have done about it because I would have been next.
Yeah.
But thankfully, I never got to. I've seen some real beatings handed out. And obviously, turns, robberies. I've been involved in a few. We could go on, but they were all done for a reason, and they ended up. We got what we wanted from it. And sometimes in this world, unfortunately, the means are justified by the end. And that goes all the way through. And remember, what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who are doing serious damage out there, whether it be people trafficking, whether it be drugs, whether it be firearms, whether it be potential terrorism. You never really know until you're in there. And what we're doing is trying to undermine that. What we're doing is trying to save lives at the end of the day.
One of the things we came across often was this issue about agent provocateur. Is the UC officer actually instigating, encouraging the criminal act? And how is it going to look when it gets to a court? Because there's no point having an elaborate and expensive and very risky undercover operation if the whole thing falls apart when you get to court. Did you guard against that? Was there a plan? Did you have a plan?
No, never. What you've done there, Tom, is taken us back to episode 1 where we spoke about result-driven operational undercover work, where there's been something stolen, you're trying to find it, where there's somebody dealing drugs, you want to capture them, where you want to go to court at the end of the day, where you want a body, you want a result. What you called low-level, and it's what we call low-level undercover work. Rightly or wrongly, it's just the terminology. What we're talking about tonight is where you put in, and there's never, ever going to be a question of you calling in the troops to come in and raid a joint or do something proactive. The whole purpose of you being there is identification of the people involved, the associations that they have, the places they frequent, their family members. All of that background information and intelligence is your only purpose in being in there. And you have to ignore what's going on. You're never going to be in court. Only colleagues I had that worked across the water during the Troubles, the latter part of the Troubles, ended up in court behind screens and whatnot, giving their evidence. But there was never any expectation for me to appear in the court of law and take the oath and give any evidence, ever, at that level.
There surely had to be some consideration given to what you were doing so that the defence of agent provocateur did not lose the case.
Maybe you're harking back to the one I told you about, the Wine Alley, where we set up and again, we set up that heroin selling operation in the Wine Alley simply to find out who would come to us. It was never used in any court case. All it did was take us up the chain. All it did was take us up the food chain. But it was never presented to anybody. It was never sworn to. It was all and that was undercover. And what I'm talking about here is working in a way that you're never going to be used as a witness, because you're blown immediately. As soon as you're used as a witness, you're no use to anybody thereafter. And our guys, some guys I knew worked in the field, and some of them were casualties, Tom, over the long term that we're talking about here. They were there for you were talking about a couple of years that they were working and never went near a police station. How on earth they functioned, I've got no idea. But we left them out there. And they were still feeding back information, they were still giving good intel that was acted on thereafter. But it's a bit like we spoke about the SB in the last episode. 99.9% of the information that came in is never acted on, but it's there when it's required.
Now, it's interesting to see, because the UC operations I supervised, there was a definite pulling people back in from time to time just to make sure that they were still functioning properly and they hadn't drifted off. And the debriefs were quite structured. It was a double-edged sword, because you weren't just gathering intelligence, what they had learned. You were actually checking on them to make sure that they were still functioning well. Because a UC operation blowing is a disaster. But if you get a UC officer being burned or burning themselves out, and alcohol, drugs, whatever other else, that's collateral damage. That's huge damage to an individual who, at the end of the day, is one of your officers, and you have a duty of care. The system I worked in, there was a structure pulling back out, and we certainly would never have left anybody for months, let alone years, without actually pulling them back in and just checking on their welfare and debriefing them and making sure they were fit and healthy and that they were still fit for the job. Because some of the people you met after they'd been undercover for a while in difficult circumstances, they were literally shell-shocked. And you could see it when you met them. They were exhibiting all the symptoms of extreme stress. Fidgety, couldn't hold a conversation, couldn't make eye contact. It was a real risk.
I think the police, they were behind the times at that stage. Not so much with undercover work, because again, we're switching back to the lower level that we were talking about in the last episode of Crime Time Inc. And I think we mentioned this, Tom, but it's worth mentioning again. It was cops who, not necessarily UCs, but they were plain clothes in that they were drug squad or whatever. When I joined the police, when I first went into the CID in 1981, I'm sure there were 2 detectives in the drug squad. That was Strathclyde Police Drug Squad. That would be 1981-82. And yet we both know what the drug squad took up nearly a whole corridor of Pitt Street within 5 years. But these guys, they began to believe their own propaganda. They had all the symptoms you've just spoken about there. They weren't undercover. They were coming into their work in the morning and ostensibly going home at night, although that's debatable. But they started to believe their own prop, and they started to behave in ways that you've just described there. But they were left in situ because they had all the intelligence. They had the contacts. They had the touts. And as you and I know, informants at that level in those days, with the amount of crime that we were dealing with, informants were a fantastic resource for us. That not every cop, I've met loads of cops who would never deal with an informant, ever. But I did all the time. I always had informants, and it was a big part of our clearance rate. It was telling guys and getting them on our team, and they were invaluable. They became our undercovers. If you do it right, you can have an undercover without taking any risk whatsoever, because he's got a habit. I had this conversation today with someone, Tom. We were talking about firearms. We were talking about firearms and the amnesty that we had back in the 90s. Just another story for another day here on Crime Time Inc. But the point I was making to him, it was a reporter, and the point I was making to him is that we try to compartmentalise things, crime especially. The police in Glasgow, all the teams were. But whereas I had been working in the drugs unit up until then, now when I collared someone, he would say, Mr. McLean, I can give you a dealer in such and such a place. And I'd say, shut up, who cares about your dealer? I'm looking for firearms. But I can give you a shoplifter. Yeah, shut up. I'm looking for firearms now. Now let's talk seriously here.
In our era, the reality is that we did not really fully understand the stresses and strains and sometimes the long-term damage that can be done by putting people under that continual stress. It would be interesting, as we're doing now, is speaking to someone like you a decade later, or maybe 20 years later, looking back now. It was an area of work you clearly enjoyed tremendously. And it was obviously an area of work you were very good at. But was it good for you?
Maybe a bit melodramatic, but that's how it feels now. Like my daughter's illness, you're trying to do things. There's a recklessness about your behaviour as well, which goes down very well in the criminal fraternity, and probably why I fitted in quite well. Because there was real anger, real resentment, and all these emotions going on about your personal life. All of a sudden you can take it out, and you think you're doing good. There's always that label that you can attach, the greater good, and that you're a good guy, and all the moral stuff that you can justify your actions with. It's all a lot of nonsense. The truth is that you join the police as a job, and it's a 40-hour-a-week job, whatever the shift patterns and all the rest of it, and it would be great if you could go through your career, and when you leave at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or whenever it might be, you take off the uniform and you go back to being Mr. Family Guy, citizen, whatever you want to be. Unfortunately, some of us took it further, and it became all-consuming. And senior detectives like this too as well, Tom. We both do. We both can think of colleagues off the top of our head that the job consumed, and they became everything. And they sacrificed their family life. They sacrificed watching their children growing up and being part of their children's lives, things that can never be replaced, ever. So the answer to your question is no. It was problems I was having that I wasn't dealing with, and the way I dealt with it was the police offered me, or I was offered a route to take that looked as though it was a solution, and all it did was make the problem a lot worse.
Yeah, I always saw it as not so much a job as a way of life. And for me, it was a way of life. There was a 10-year period when I was in the serious crime squad and whatnot, where I more or less disappeared from family because I was working 12, 14 hours a day away doing this, and some of it was work and some of it was socialising. It was sometimes very difficult to see where the ends met. But I was away for a huge tranche of time, and that was regrettable. It was regrettable from a family point of view, and I wish I'd had more balance there. But did I regret it, and would I have changed anything at the time? No, I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. No.
Hindsight's a great gift, Tom, isn't it? But you and I you're a career policeman, and that's what we would say. And I know lots of guys in every walk of life.
Mhm.
And it's the same choices that people make, whether they're running a business, whether they're working a job as an executive or whatever. I met a cop through in your neck of the woods actually last year. I was in Morrison's picking up a sandwich at lunchtime. I can't remember why I'd been dragged through to Edinburgh. It must have been something really dire to get me across there. But I was in Morrison's in Kilstorfin, I think, in that area. And this old inspector came up and recognised me, and he went, "Simon McLean, blah, blah, blah." And he was working in the vegetable aisle. I maybe told you this before, Tom, but he was working in that first aisle, the first aisle in Morrison's, and he had his peony on, his Morrison's peony and all that. And I said, I won't tell you his name in case you go and do your shopping in there. And he was like a pig in shit, if I can use that expression on Crime Time Inc., without shocking our listeners. But he just, all the pressure off, he'd been retired about 3 months, and this was his dream job that he'd found here, chatting to all the ladies as they came in and looking after his shelves, spraying them with water and all that. He had his wee spray bottle. Fantastic. And yet you think 30 years of thinking that you think you're a much bigger cog in the wheel than you really are, Tom. That's the truth of the matter. Because the minute you walk out the door, you're a stranger. You're a civvy.
No, that's right. Has anybody ever said, Simon McLean, you've done this particular job for far too long than is good for you or good for the service. You'll have to change. Has anybody ever say that to you?
No, not at all. And I can see why not, Tom, because I never went over the edge. It's difficult. At the time, you think you know where the edge is, but you'd be the last person to realise if you went over it. That's the truth. There were procedures in place. There were touchstones that we had to mark. And although I made light of it and said that we would meet in the pub or whatever, we would never meet in a police station or anything like that. But now that I think about it, and I knew at the time I was being sussed out as much as the operation. The operation was important and the information, but all that took care of itself. Really, it was a DCI actually that was handling me. He was really making sure that Simon McLean could keep functioning, could keep doing the job. I think his major concern was the operation at all times, not just Simon McLean. Do you think that guy in Morrison's might have been undercover? It's just dawned on me.
It's been a very interesting conversation about the whole world of undercover working. My view was it's absolutely essential, and you cannot beat the quality of evidence and information and intelligence you get from a well-placed UC undercover officer. But it's risky and it's high tariff. And unless you're very careful, you can do huge damage to the individual and sometimes the reputation of the police service if it goes wrong. I'm thinking now about the carry-on there was down south where quite a number of officers were put into work undercover in I think there were environmental protesters and ended up striking up relationships, and there was illegitimate children and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And that stuff is, you can see how, if you've been involved in it, you can see exactly how it happens.
For sure.
Enormously damaging to the reputation of the police service in the end.
Just for my own reputation, I can clear the record a wee bit here and say that I didn't meet any of my wives whilst undercover. Okay? Just in case any of them are listening. I've done a wee blog for our website that people see if they get onto crimetimeinc.com. And I've done a wee blog about our chat about undercover work because I really wanted to. It's only when you're writing things down that you can really sometimes get to the essence of some things. And I think the point of it was really to say that we do owe our undercovers today a real debt of gratitude, because the dangers that we face today are probably tenfold from what they were back then in escalation and the plans that are going on. The world's much smaller now, so we have threats coming from many more angles. And our guys that are working across the country, across the continent, and further afield in these environments, we do owe them a debt of service. But they know they're under the radar. They know that sometimes there's no escape route because it would be politically. It was seen from a Yvonne Fletcher podcast with John Murray that they're made for much bigger reasons than we will ever be told politically. So these guys and girls that are working all over the world on our behalf are really, there's thwarting threats that we never ever get to hear about. And the threats are real and the threats are out there. And all of us would rather we didn't need undercover police officers, because it is just a horrible place that people have to go and deal with. And it would be better if we didn't have them. But it's a necessary evil in today's society, I'm afraid.
And I absolutely agree with that. And you're absolutely right. And the thing is that their success or their failure will never be seen and never be measured. But just now and again, something will come up and you'll see some desperate act of terrorism or some desperate criminal act which has been headed off at the pass quite successfully. And then you can say, and you just get a little glimpse of the absolute need for these kinds of officers.
When I'm watching the royalty on TV or anywhere where there's personal protection going on, where there's a detail, it's the same with the CIA when they come over with the president and all that stuff. And you see the front, the overt, people say to me, they're all wearing sunglasses and they've all got their hand inside their jacket. That's overt security. That's for everyone to see and know. And I'm always looking for the sniper on the roof and for the UCs that are within the crowd, the UCs that are next to the stage, the UCs that are bringing them out onto the stage dressed in the suit and tie. They're all over the place, the sound engineer, whoever it might be. And that's always going on under the surface. And that's as it should be.
Yeah, that's right. Just for accuracy's sake, it's the Secret Service who protect the presidents, them that come over.
What did I say?
The CIA.
You think I'd know that after all the films we've watched of them?
Can I say that for all the hardship you've been through, you've come out relatively unmarked. You look almost normal.
I like that word, relatively. When I was operating in these circumstances, and it's coming back quite clearly to me too, I was always cynical. I always wanted to be cautious. Talking about criminals now, I was one of them. And I was always the advocate of, there could be a cop, or it could be this, or how do we know that, or how do we know the next thing? And I was always seen as very cynical and risk-averse, the exact opposite of agent provocateur, because when they all get caught, I could have said, I told you. One thing we never spoke about was getting caught, Tom. I've spent many a night in a police cell, and now that's how far the legend goes, that you could never tell. It's the other thing about the Irish programme I was watching last night. The two UCs, we would never have let them have any inkling that they weren't civilians. And many a time I got hoovered up along with the Neds, and I just had to go with the flow until it had run its course. Getting you in there was always the tricky bit, usually a pub or something, but it all had to happen quite naturally. So you were never really provoking anything. You were trying to get inserted into what was already going down. I only worked in Scotland maybe half the time, and it was generally not Glasgow. We might end up passing through Glasgow or coming into Glasgow, but Glasgow was dangerous because I knew a lot of cops. And the worst I ever had was driving through Shawlands, and there was a cop on points duty, and he waved to me. And thankfully, nobody saw it, and I ignored it completely, obviously. Too dodgy, too risky. So for that reason alone, I didn't work in Glasgow very much, because we don't have that many criminals through here anyway. I tell you the truth, I don't think I ever worked in Edinburgh because I just couldn't. I couldn't fit in. I've experienced this my whole life, Tom, that there's a different mentality from Edinburgh, the west and the east entirely.
You're doing yourself down. I know places that you'd fit it in absolutely perfectly. You would. I'm not giving you a compliment here.
I know, I knew that. I'm just surprised you knew them. Knew of them. You knew of them. Tom, the truth is that we would use any method you can think of to get into a situation where nobody would notice you. Whether it be putting a white coat on at a hospital and putting a stethoscope round your neck, whether it be sitting begging in the street. I think I perfected the tramp, the beggar. Whether it be going to a gay club many a time, all these scenarios, whether it be going into prison, whether it be going into a prison cell, whatever it might be, we would utilise it to get in. And from then on, you're on the other side of the fence, and you would never risk confiding in a police officer or civilian or anybody. From then on, you're on the other side of the line. Totally, 100%.
Yeah, I can understand that. And let's say, Simon, that you've perfected your tramp act perfectly, but you've retired now, so you can give it up. You don't need to.
I still sell the big issue.
Everybody
needs a hobby. Come on, Tom.
I did wonder at your dress sense, but it all falls into place now. I realise now.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
Oh yeah, many a time you got yourself into situations that you would be doing a door knock, wanting to speak to somebody, shall we say, on the wrong side of the field. And there was many a times that I've had crossbows pointed at my chest, I've had a gun held to my head, threatened with knives. And particularly when you're female, especially if it's somebody male that you're looking at or you're confronting for something, they target your sexuality, and almost always it's a sexual threat because you're female, because they think that you're easy to intimidate. I'm 5'0" and I don't think I ever back down from anybody.